Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Mark, and it's really great to be here at this TV party. I consider myself a film person, so I'm probably an interloper of some sort, but I will take any opportunity I can get to go off on Bill Gunn and talk about Bill Gunn. Um, it's kind of a contracted period of time because I think I have 30 minutes, so I'm kind of going to jump in and just talk a little bit about it. So, elegant and experimental director Bill Gunn is best remembered for his erotic vampire cult classic, Ganja and Hess. However, Gunn's less explored television work was equally strange and brilliant, including this episode of American Parade entitled Sojourner. In it, the usually experimental Gunn directly takes on history and social justice, but the production and reception histories reveal that rather than monumentalizing Sojourner Truth, he sought to use moving images to self-proclaimedly explore her energy and without romanticism. Thereabout, he unsettles rather than reifies the American state's slavery mythology and its tradition of vacantly venerating the images of black heroes like MLK, Rosa Parks, as a distraction from its continuing racial oppression. So, move to this wonderful photograph of Vinnette Carroll, who plays Sojourner in this episode. And I'll give a little production background. And I don't know if my animations are going to work, but that's kind of how PowerPoint is always for me. So, American Parade was a biographical series planned around the U.S. bicentennial that ran over the course of 3 years, from 1974 to 1976. Executive producer Joel Heller focused on youth in TV, and he was the executive producer of that program. Producer Lois Bianchi produced several experimental theatrical television projects, including one with theater director Robert Wilson. Given her background in intensely avant-garde and semi-narrative efforts, we might read Sojourner's kind of scrappy aesthetics as deliberate bending of the form of the biopic. So Bianchi's artistic approach to film and video medium was met in the team she put together for the project, namely Bill Gunn as writer, Vinnette Carroll as lead actor, and as director, the industry safe Peter Levin. So Carroll was not only an actor, but a theater director and a playwright, best known for her 1972 Tony Award-winning production, Don't Bother Me, I Can't Cope, the first Broadway show ever directed by a black woman, and later for her play, Arms Too Short to Box with God. This was neither Gunn's nor Carroll's first foray into television. He had won a Washington area local Emmy in 1972 for the television production of his play, Johannes. And Carroll had won a New York local Emmy for Beyond the Blues, a dramatic poetry program on WCBS. In characterizing Truth, Gunn does away with the notion of blackness as a church undivided, as well as the ebony saint. In one interview, Gunn theorized his work in writing Sojourner. Okay, now my animations work, but anyway. So you get a little closer look at all these folks. I just like how Bill Gunn actually looks really different in the two pictures. And then this is Peter Levin. Okay. So he says, I experience what I'm writing in a very sensual way, Gunn says, and it comes from my old days as an actor. And then he goes on to say, I kept Sojourner from being a romantic. She and I are long past the Horatio Alger thing. I really got interested in the woman. Her energy attracted me. Where did all that power come from to do all those things and go as far as she got in history? It's a survival thing, Gunn stated bluntly. You can be a hungry person, but it's the energy and the variety of your energy that gets you to food. It's the energy of a person that propels him to such a special place in history. So Gunn's had first encountered Truth, I love this story, as a child through his mother, who wrote a radio play on Truth that aired on a local Philadelphia radio station. What was relevant to him about Truth when he was a child was retained in his approach to this teleplay. So he said, I remember I kept asking my mother questions like, where was she born? Was she tall? Did she have a little boy like me? So Gunn's determination to eschew sentimentality, I think, is evident in the teleplay's aesthetics and in its advertising. So the ad removes the visible nobility of the character and engages with the features of blackness that some white folks might associate with disgust or recoil from. She's not beautiful in any traditional Eurocentric sense. Her teeth are crooked. Her clothes are seemingly ill-fitting and irrelevant. We might even see like a blaxploitation aesthetic going on here in some ways in terms of her directed dress. So anyhow, I think they're sort of rejecting. She's rejecting features of being a graceful lady in order to gain power and force, and that's really, I think, typical of the approach we see throughout this piece. So what we get instead of a portrait of respectable gentility and a historical narrative tightly bound to America's own is sketches of a passionate Christian mystic whose life appears in snatches from the mist rather than whole cloth. Gunn returns us to a figure who was formed in a time when the notion of African American freedom was not yet fully freighted with the baggage and language of the anti-slavery movement, where Black people could conceive of freedom more freely, if that makes sense. And he makes Truth a character who feels her way through this. Gunn, who deserves to be considered a fixture of Black American Afrofuturist imaginary, here furthers this work by portraying Truth as an otherworldly migrant whose power lies in a sense in her abstraction, or more specifically, her ability to resist the constricting tendencies of both form and space. As was true of the spirit Truth sought, we get a sense of the wisps of her life, almost as a disjointed tale, rather than a building narrative or a climaxing story, a fact which was noted in the reviews. For example, the LA Times reviewer called the program a, quote, fuzzy outline of an abolitionist, lacking in historical or personal context, providing sketches of Sojourner's life that view slavery as an oddly dressed rehearsal for the civil rights movement. I like to think that Gunn, who made an auteurist decision here, would have actually taken pride in these negative reviews, which accurately capture how his drama differs from the average television docudrama's stilted hero's journey and reified narratives of the day. Instead, like its protagonist, the story wends. So I just want to, so this Truth is mystic. And I want to talk about her a little bit in terms of the birth of intersectional feminism, as we've come to really discuss this idea. So predating Anna Julia Cooper, Harriet Jacobs, and Harriet Tubman, Truth may well be the very first Black American figure to publicly invoke intersectionality, or the overlapping fault lines of race, class, and gender in the formation of selfhood. As historian Nell Painter put it, and as her most famous speech, Aren't I a Woman, underlined, as an abolitionist and feminist, she put her body and mind toward the unique task, that of physically representing women who had been enslaved. And this at a time when most Americans thought of slaves as male and women as white. Painter also points out, quote, no other woman who had been through the ordeal of slavery managed to survive with sufficient strength, poise, and self-confidence to be a public figure in the long term. Especially, we might add, as being a public figure in America required working with white people, submitting oneself to white eyes, white expectation, and white lies. We see this dicing and slicing of the self that interlocking identities require in the scenes where the newly reborn Truth separates from her son. Though the first scene has featured Sojourner literally running, cutting barefoot solidly through the space of a field and the town to the courthouse and telling us in urgent voiceover that she has got to save her son, and the second scene has given us the traditional televisual pleasures of their reunion. The third scene reveals Peter as a young man, played by Lawrence Hilton Jacobs, who has gotten into trouble with the law, perhaps because she's not watching him closely. So about this, Gunn stated, I kept reading about her relationship with her son, a boy she fought to free from servitude, and then abandoned to his own devices as an adult. no one would really deal with the fact that her drive had a great deal of selfishness to it. With Sojourner, he said, the selfishness and self-determination of duty to her people came to a peak with that boy. Sojourner is a mother in this series, but in that uniquely intersectional way is not only a mother. In order to be whole and to live out her purpose, she must put motherhood to the side in the same way that she prioritized it initially. She must evolve into a sojourner. And while her inability to be both does not please her, she is certain of it. As she points out, motherhood, white women's motherhood, is by design all-encompassing. Her struggle to be free from slavery is not pictured, but her fight to free her son and then free herself from him so that she can free others is deeply telling about the meanings and dynamics of Black women's freedom and its costs. We can hear the generational struggle to define freedom and Black agendas, not only with her son, but with her grandson, in the last clip we'll see here, and in her interactions with Frederick Douglass, who chides Truth for washing white babies and singing. Though the script is punctuated with the expected conversations and speeches, with Truth pushing for her rights, decrying slavery, and looking to God for direction, this soundtrack in many ways is haunted and out of sync with the narrative turns which compel us to look at the many contradictions and complexities within Blackness and indeed within the woman herself. So let's start with that first clip, which is actually her first instance of giving a speech that we see in the piece. So in Sojourner's anti-slavery oration, she is able to connect with her audience in part by her awkwardness, her humor, which disarms, and her quick-witted ability to meet people where they are.
I know not,
Oops.
but she left deep memories behind her.
Little preview there. So she listens as well as she speaks. The singing is a way in for her, not only because her audience knows the song, but also it appears because of her voice. The voice of Truth is an incongruence that draws attention due to the apparent mismatch between the low voice and the skirted form. With the spirit of the dozens, she one-ups the men heckling her, and she's genuinely more funny than they are. In the process, she shows them to be bodies as well, making visible their white frames as spectacle. And at the same time, she seems to channel James Baldwin with questions like, are you sure God isn't Black? Are you sure you're not? Are you sure you're not, essentially? The gallows humor and the sense of desperation and death produce laughter fit to kill in her audience, as when she tells them she's asked God to make her masters good, but if he can't, to kill them, which produces laughter. So there's a moral turn here, but it happens through comedy. And the air that she leaves them with is not one of triumph or of having saved souls, but rather of having left people to struggle on with themselves. So let's go to the next scene, which I'm talking about in terms of owning the body. So the teleplay climaxes with the cornerstone and stumbling block of her flesh revealed like lightning and beneath the sound of thunder that rocks the courtroom. It's here where the power of truth to convert not just minds and souls to God, but to turn whiteness's horrible, spectacular power back on itself is revealed. She reveals her breast, and it feels like an act of God. The shot ends on a medium shot of a suited white man beholding her breasts, and we cut to commercial, which reveals a suited white man in medium shot. Kenneth Hay argues that television commercials did more than sell products. They were designed to interact with the drama itself, with the commercial message benefiting from the peaks that each act of the program created. The commercial's narrator was meant to lend familiarity, continuity, and trustworthiness. But in Gunn's drama, the match on action between the white man who would exploit Truth's body and the white man who represents the sponsor in the commercial causes the gripping scene to bleed over into the commercial space, intentionally or not condemning the sponsor, ironically the company that owned Yale Locks, and calling into question the trustworthiness of his direct address. Worth noting, perhaps, is that the first time breasts were shown in film, after the production code's passage was The Pawnbroker, where it was also a black woman who bared her breasts, and similar questions of exploitation were raised. So Gunn has a way of making a medium intended for advertising into a medium alive with bodily struggle, awkwardness, and the liveness of the precipice. From moment to moment, we know not where Sojourner or God is leading, and the muddled struggle for expression of her vision and to find the clarity of her path is marked and surprising as as marked and surprising as the profundity of her words and their effect on her hearers. Vinnette Carroll's strong and gender-fluid form casts doubt on the ascendancy of the gendered body, pointing to the fascinating inability of gender to explain the human form as we see it and feel it, its failure to capture categories like energy and presence. Sojourner is legible as a narrative, this whole piece, as a narrative of bodies in relation, a text that also pushes attention towards the multivalent body at every turn. In one scene, Truth scrubs the naked bodies of white children in an anti-slavery commune. Later, a primly dressed abolitionist, as we saw, is hit on the bottom during a stump speech. Finally, there's a graphic discussion in what follows of dysentery and the sexual passions derived from killing white men in the Civil War. So Gunn himself, a gay man who died of AIDS in 1989, knew something about being seen as ill-fitting for the body and about struggles with the body. So Gunn has a Christian's level of fixity, I would argue, on the flesh and blood and their relationship to spiritual things without the investments in the white version of Christianity's narrow way. He has a narrow way, I would argue, himself, but it's a different one. So let's end with this final scene, which I'm calling our so-called glory, where Sojourner Truth meets with her grandson. So similarly powerful is this scene of Sojourner talking with her grandson, James. His story and his supine body tell yet another tale through the power of the flesh. In it, he speaks of black flesh glorying in the killing of slave masters, black flesh being separated from white flesh at burial, pronouncing segregation's final word, and flesh of fellow black soldiers splattered on James's own flesh and mind in irreversible ways. In this repetition of cruelties, we have a prime example of the phenomenon that theorist Hortense Spillers spoke of. Quote, even though the captive body flesh has been liberated, it remains grounded in the originating metaphors of captivity and mutilation, so that it is as if neither time nor history nor historiography in its topics shows movement, as the human subject is murdered over and over again by the passions of the bloodless and anonymous archaism or artifact. So, unquote. In this case, the white image of black Americans, whether they are aunties, old women, or wild-fighting Africans, is the archaism that continues as a monument to black captivity and mutilation. The sequence here, as earlier, moves to commercial, leaving a dangling question. Has all this moved the hearts of the Northerners that neither Sojourner, the program, nor the audience dares to answer? So Gunn's unresolved screen epic on Sojourner Truth is an important example of the themes running through his creative projects, bringing his meditation on black bodies at work to a youth-centered national televisual audience. I forgot to mention that. This was a youth program. It offers an alternative approach to historical biography to a generation that would soon receive roots, focusing far more on the abstract yet important personal and public moments that make up a life. So thanks so much for listening.